After the engagement, the world seemed to slow, as though uncertain how to proceed now that its grand announcement had been made. Autumn settled over Ravensmere estate with deliberate grace, burnishing the trees into gold and rust, softening the air into something almost kind. Eleanor arrived there with her family under the banner of celebration, yet she felt less a guest than an object carefully placed where it would not distract from the main design. Days passed in measured rituals: breakfast beneath tall windows, walks along gravel paths, evenings filled with polite music. Charlotte moved through them effortlessly, already assuming the manner of a duchess, her laughter echoing through corridors that would soon belong to her. Julian was attentive, unfailingly correct, and Eleanor told herself that this, at least, was mercy. Distance could be endured. What she had not anticipated was proximity sharpened by silence. It began with a book. She found it one morning on the small escritoire in her bedchamber, its leather worn smooth by use. There was no note, no crest, only a pressed sprig of rosemary tucked between the pages. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she opened it. It was a volume of essays she had once mentioned admiring, years ago, in passing, when Julian had paused beside her in a drawing-room and asked what she read for pleasure. The memory rose now with painful clarity. Remembrance is a treacherous form of intimacy. She should have returned it at once. Instead, she read until the fire burned low, until the words blurred and the rosemary scented the air with quiet accusation. By morning, she had resolved to say nothing. Gratitude, like affection, could be dangerous if displayed too freely. The days offered no relief. Julian sought her opinion during walks, addressed her directly at table, asked after her comfort with an attention that felt both deliberate and deniable. To anyone watching, it was courtesy extended to a future sister. To Eleanor, it felt like a hand placed too near a flame. She responded with restraint honed to near invisibility, though each exchange left her breathless in its wake. Others noticed. The first whisper reached her through a maid's downcast eyes, the second through a pause in conversation that grew heavy when she entered a room. Society did not require proof, it thrived on suggestion. Eleanor became conscious of her movements, her expressions, the precise angle at which she stood when Julian was near. She could not escape the sense that she was being weighed and found wanting, not for what she had done, but for what others imagined she desired. Charlotte, at first, seemed untouched by suspicion. She spoke warmly of Eleanor, insisted upon her presence, clasped her arm with sisterly affection. Yet something subtle shifted. Her smiles tightened, her questions lingered a moment too long. Once, Eleanor caught her watching Julian watch her, and the look that passed between them was brief, unreadable, and unsettling. Another token followed. It was a pair of gloves, laid neatly beside Eleanor's place in the music room, pale kid leather stitched with delicate care. She recognized them at once. Months ago, during a charity recital, she had admired a similar pair in a shop window, remarking on their workmanship without expectation. Julian had been beside her then, listening in silence. Now the gloves rested like a confession she had not agreed to hear. This time, she confronted him. They met in the long gallery, where portraits of grim-faced ancestors lined the walls. Afternoon light spilled through tall windows, striping the floor with gold. Eleanor held the gloves between them, her composure brittle with effort. "These were misplaced," she said evenly. "I believe they are yours to return." Julian did not reach for them. His gaze rested on her face with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "They were meant for you," he replied quietly. "I did not think they would cause distress." "Everything causes distress," she said, before she could stop herself. The truth of it rang between them, undeniable. For a moment, he looked as though he might speak further, say something reckless and irrevocable. Instead, footsteps approached, and the moment collapsed into propriety. He inclined his head, she withdrew, and the gloves remained in her hands like a burden she could not set down. The scandal bloomed soon after. At dinner one evening, a remark was made, lightly, carelessly, about attentions misdirected and affections confused. Laughter followed, but it carried an edge. Eleanor felt the heat rise to her face, felt Charlotte's gaze settle upon her with new sharpness. Julian said nothing. His silence, meant perhaps as restraint, felt like abandonment. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked the garden paths beneath a moon veiled in cloud. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. As she turned back toward the house, voices drifted through an open window, unguarded by distance. Charlotte was speaking, her tone low, insistent. Julian answered her, his words indistinct, save for one phrase that reached Eleanor with cruel clarity. "It was never my intention," he said, "for her to suffer." Eleanor stepped back into shadow, her heart pounding, the night suddenly too small to contain what had begun. She understood then that whatever this was, kindness, regret, or something far more dangerous, it was already beyond her control, and the cost had only begun to reveal itself. She lingered there, listening until the voices faded, until the house resumed its careful breathing. In that suspended hour she felt the shift within herself, subtle yet irrevocable. The hope she had buried did not rise. Instead, something colder took its place, a vigilance sharpened by knowledge. She was no longer merely unseen. She was observed, interpreted, discussed. The tokens were not gifts but signals, and every signal invited consequence. As Eleanor returned indoors, smoothing her expression into calm, she knew the silence ahead would demand more courage than any confession. Dawn, she sensed, would bring neither clarity nor mercy, only brighter light upon fragile reputations. Morning broke without ceremony, pale light spilling across Ravensmere as though nothing irrevocable had occurred. Yet the house felt altered, its familiar corridors bearing the echo of choices made and reputations unsettled. Eleanor rose early, dressed simply, and faced her reflection with a steadiness she scarcely recognized. The night's turmoil had not lessened her resolve. It had refined it, sharpening thought into purpose. By breakfast, the scandal had acquired a pulse. Servants moved with heightened care, eyes lowered, voices hushed. Charlotte did not appear. Julian neither sought Eleanor nor avoided her, though his absence was felt as distinctly as presence once had been. The world, she understood, had begun to realign itself around the truth, and truth was rarely gentle in its rearrangements. Eleanor requested her sister's presence before noon. Charlotte received her in a private sitting room, her posture rigid, her expression composed to the point of fragility. For a long moment, neither spoke. The bond between them, forged in childhood intimacy, strained beneath the weight of betrayal and love alike. "I did not ask for this," Eleanor said at last, her voice measured. "Nor did I encourage it." Charlotte's laugh was brief and bitter. "Love does not require encouragement," she replied. "Only opportunity." She studied Eleanor closely. "Tell me, then, was it worth it?" The question pierced, not in accusation, but in weary honesty. Eleanor met her sister's gaze without evasion. "It has cost me everything I once relied upon," she said. "If that is worth, then yes. But I would have borne silence forever to spare you pain." Charlotte looked away, blinking rapidly. When she spoke again, her tone had softened. "I was chosen," she said quietly. "That mattered to me." After a pause, she added, "Perhaps it still does." They parted without resolution, yet without cruelty. Some wounds, Eleanor knew, healed only with distance, and some never closed at all. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the estate. Letters arrived bearing concern thinly veiled as curiosity. Julian received them alone, refusing counsel, dismissing comfort. He walked the grounds with restless determination, as though pacing the boundary of his former life. When at last he sought Eleanor, it was not to persuade, but to confess the full measure of his intent. "I have written to my solicitors," he told her as they stood beneath an ancient oak, its leaves whispering overhead. "The title will pass to my cousin. I will keep only what is necessary." She stared at him, stunned. "You would relinquish everything?" "Everything that binds me to falsehood," he replied. "If love is to be chosen, it must be chosen freely." The magnitude of the gesture left her breathless. This was no impulsive declaration, no romantic excess. It was sacrifice rendered deliberate, irrevocable. Eleanor felt the final barrier within her begin to crumble, not in surrender, but in recognition. That evening, Ravensmere hosted its last gathering under Julian's name. Attendance was sparse, the mood subdued. Whispers trailed Eleanor as she entered the room, no longer hidden, no longer peripheral. She moved with quiet assurance, aware that judgment lingered, yet unafraid. Julian joined her, offering his arm without ceremony. She accepted, the contact steady and calm. When the final guests departed, they stood alone in the great hall, candlelight trembling across stone and silk. Julian turned to her, his voice low. "I have made my choice," he said. "I will not ask you to justify it. Only to share it, if you can." Eleanor felt the stillness settle, the culmination of longing, restraint, and courage converging into a single moment. She thought of the years she had loved unseen, of the dignity she had guarded like a shield. To step forward now was not to abandon herself, but to claim the right to be known. "I will not follow you into disgrace," she said softly. "Nor will I hide behind your sacrifice." He listened, intent, reverent. "If we are to begin," she continued, "it must be as equals, unafraid of consequence, unwilling to diminish one another." Julian's breath shuddered. "That is all I have ever hoped for." She placed her hand in his then, not trembling but firm. The gesture felt both ordinary and momentous, a simple act weighted with choice. Outside, the night deepened, vast and uncertain, yet no longer hostile. In the days that followed, they departed Ravensmere together, not as duke and dependent, but as two souls unmoored and resolute. Society would speak, history would judge, but Eleanor felt no regret. Love, she had learned, was not the absence of fear, but the courage to move despite it. As the carriage carried them away, Eleanor looked back once, not in longing, but in farewell. Ahead lay a life uncharted, stripped of illusion, rich with promise. She turned to Julian, meeting his gaze with quiet certainty, and understood that the shadows she had once inhabited had taught her how to stand fully in the light. The days following the confession unfolded with an unnatural calm, as though the house itself conspired to hold its breath. Ravensmere moved through its routines, yet every corridor felt narrowed by unspoken truth. Eleanor carried herself with impeccable composure, answering questions, attending meals, fulfilling expectations with a precision that bordered on self-erasure. What had changed was invisible to others but absolute within her. She now knew the shape of Julian's feeling, and knowledge, once acquired, refused to loosen its grip. Julian, by contrast, seemed altered in ways subtle yet unmistakable. His courtesy remained, but its polish had dulled, replaced by a gravity that drew notice. He watched Eleanor with careful restraint, never seeking her out, never quite avoiding her. Charlotte observed this with a growing sharpness, her smiles bright yet brittle, her laughter pitched a fraction too high. The house hummed with tension, elegant and perilous. The inevitable moment arrived not with spectacle, but with summons. Charlotte requested Eleanor's presence in the blue sitting room one afternoon, her tone affectionate, her eyes unreadable. Sunlight spilled across the rugs, illuminating a space arranged for intimacy and judgment alike. Charlotte gestured for Eleanor to sit, then did the same herself, folding her hands with deliberate calm. "You have always been honest with me," Charlotte began. "I should like that to continue." Eleanor inclined her head, every instinct urging caution. "Of course." Charlotte studied her for a long moment. "Julian is troubled," she said at last. "He grows distant, distracted. I wonder if you know why." The question landed cleanly, precisely. Eleanor met it without flinching. "I know only what he has chosen to share." A pause followed, thick with possibility. Charlotte smiled then, a practiced curve that did not reach her eyes. "I have always admired your discretion," she said. "It is one of your better qualities." The dismissal was gentle, but unmistakable. Eleanor rose when dismissed, her dignity intact, her heart bruised by the implication that silence was both her strength and her sentence. That evening, the household gathered for a small dinner, intimate yet formal, attended by a handful of close relations. Conversation flowed, brittle but controlled, until Julian set down his glass. The sound cut cleanly through the room. Eleanor felt it in her chest before she understood its intent. "There is a matter," Julian said, his voice steady, "that I can no longer defer." Charlotte turned toward him, surprise flickering across her features. Others followed her gaze. Eleanor remained very still, every sense alert. "I entered this engagement," Julian continued, "believing that duty alone could sustain a marriage. I was wrong." A murmur stirred, quickly stilled. "To proceed now would be an act of dishonesty I cannot reconcile with honor." Charlotte's color drained, then returned in a flush of disbelief. "Julian," she said softly, warning threaded through her tone. He did not look at Eleanor, yet she felt herself named. "I release you," he said to Charlotte, "from any promise made between us." Silence fell, vast and consuming. Charlotte rose abruptly, her chair scraping back. "You disgrace us all," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. Without waiting for reply, she left the room, the door closing behind her with finality. The remaining guests dispersed in stunned fragments. Eleanor remained seated, her pulse thunderous, her mind racing. Julian turned to her then, his composure fraying at last. "I did not do this for you," he said quickly. "I did it because truth demanded it." She rose, her expression grave. "And what truth is that?" "That I love you," he said, the words unadorned, irrevocable. "And that loving you requires more courage than I have ever shown." Eleanor felt the room tilt. "Love," she said, steadying herself against the table. "You offer it now, when its cost has become visible." "I offer it knowing the cost," he replied. "I will accept exile, scandal, whatever consequence follows, if only I may be honest." She searched his face, seeing not triumph but vulnerability laid bare. "And what of me?" she asked. "What am I to endure?" He stepped closer, stopping short, as before. "Only what you choose," he said. "I ask nothing. I hope for everything." Eleanor turned away, walking to the window where night pressed close. She thought of years spent shrinking herself into acceptability, of loving in silence, of dignity maintained through denial. To accept him now would alter her forever. To refuse would confirm the world's expectation that she remain unseen. She turned back, her voice quiet but resolute. "I will not be the consolation for a broken promise," she said, "nor the cause of another woman's ruin." "You are neither," Julian replied. "You are the reason I finally see myself clearly." Before she could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor, hurried and purposeful. Voices rose beyond the door, sharp with inquiry, already shaping the narrative that would spread by morning. Eleanor met Julian's gaze, understanding dawning between them. The declaration had been made, the line crossed, and whatever followed would demand a choice she could no longer postpone. The chandeliers of Harrington House burned like captive suns, their light cascading over silk gowns and polished boots, over faces schooled into pleasant interest. Music breathed through the room, a waltz swelling and retreating like a tide, yet beneath it ran another current, whispers, quick as needles, sharp as frost. Society had gathered not merely to dance, but to observe, to measure, to decide who mattered and who did not. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe stood at the very edge of that brilliance, half hidden by a marble column veined with gray. She wore dove-colored satin, chosen for modesty rather than notice, and gloves that concealed hands long accustomed to holding books instead of admirers. From where she stood, she could see nearly everything and be seen by almost no one. It was a position she knew well. Eleanor had learned early that to survive such rooms was to become part of the architecture, present, useful, unremarked. Across the ballroom, laughter rippled like a dropped ribbon. Her sister Charlotte stood at its center, radiant in rose silk, curls arranged with calculated artlessness. Gentlemen leaned toward her as though drawn by gravity, their expressions alight with possibility. Charlotte accepted their attention easily. It belonged to her by birth and beauty, and she wore it as she wore her jewels, without apology. Eleanor watched with a fondness that ached, for love and envy often shared a pulse. Then there was the Duke. Julian Ashford, Duke of Ravensmere, stood near the orchestra, tall and composed, his dark hair touched with silver by the chandelier's glow. He spoke to no one in particular and yet commanded the room. Even stillness seemed to serve him. Eleanor felt his presence before she allowed herself to look, the way one senses a storm gathering beyond the horizon. When at last her gaze betrayed her, it met his profile, strong, thoughtful, familiar in a way that startled her anew each time. She had known him for years. Known his courtesy, his measured kindness, the way his voice softened when speaking to those with nothing to offer him. She had known, too, the danger of that kindness. For Eleanor had loved him silently, thoroughly, and without hope. It was a love built from moments so small no one else would have claimed them, a shared smile over a forgotten book, a pause in conversation to ask her opinion, a look that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessity allowed. Such moments, hoarded in solitude, grew vast enough to feel like fate. She remembered, unbidden, a winter afternoon in the library when snow pressed against the windows and he had laughed at something she said, genuinely, unguarded. She remembered the warmth of that sound long after the room had emptied, and how she had carried it home like contraband. It was astonishing how memory could masquerade as promise, how the mind embroidered courtesy into destiny when it so desperately wished to be chosen. The music shifted, applause fluttered, and attention subtly rearranged itself. Eleanor sensed it before she understood it, the collective inhale of expectation. A footman crossed the floor with purposeful speed. The hostess raised her hand. Conversations faltered. Julian stepped forward. "My friends," he said, his voice calm, carrying easily. Eleanor felt it strike her like a bell rung too close. "Your patience, if you please." She should have looked away. She did not. He spoke of gratitude, of family, of the honor of shared celebration. Each word felt rehearsed, proper, safe. Eleanor's heart beat strangely, as though it recognized a path even before the mind did. Then he turned, just slightly, and extended his hand. Charlotte stepped forward. The room erupted, not loudly, but thoroughly. Smiles bloomed. Whispers sharpened into certainty. Eleanor heard nothing and everything at once as Julian announced his engagement to Miss Charlotte Ashcombe. Her sister's hand rested in his with a grace that belonged to paintings and promises. Charlotte blushed, delighted, unafraid. She had been chosen, and the world approved. Eleanor's breath left her in a thin, unsteady stream. Around her, the chandeliers burned on, indifferent. She felt suddenly transparent, as though joy itself passed through her without resistance. She thought of all the silences she had mistaken for restraint, all the kindness she had mistaken for something singular. Love, she realized dimly, was often only the story one told oneself in the dark. She forced herself to applaud. The sound seemed to come from someone else. Julian's eyes lifted then, roaming the crowd as if in search of something misplaced. For a moment, only a moment, they found her. The expression that crossed his face was too fleeting to name, regret, perhaps, or something more dangerous. Eleanor lowered her gaze at once, as she had trained herself to do. Dignity, after all, was the last refuge of the unloved. The remainder of the evening passed in fragments. Congratulations brushed past her like cold air. Charlotte laughed, radiant, promising happiness. Eleanor offered smiles, offered silence, offered herself up as evidence of contentment. Inside, something rearranged itself, not breaking, but hardening. She understood then that survival would require a new discipline. Not hope, but restraint sharpened into armor, worn so well no one would suspect the wound beneath. Later, as the guests drifted toward supper, Eleanor slipped away into a dim antechamber lined with ancestral portraits. The house exhaled here, old stone and oil paint holding the echoes of forgotten lives. She stood alone, hands braced against the back of a chair, and allowed herself one honest breath, steadying herself against the certainty of what had been lost. From the ballroom beyond came Julian's voice again, nearer now, softened, speaking her name. "Miss Eleanor." She turned, heart unsteady, as he stepped into the shadowed room, the light behind him closing like a door. Rain fell with patient insistence against the glass roof of the conservatory, turning the world beyond into a blur of green and silver. Eleanor stood among the orange trees, their blossoms breathing sweetness into the damp air, her hands clasped before her as though in prayer. She had not planned to be there, yet instinct had carried her to the one place in the house where voices softened and secrets seemed less impossible. Julian came quietly, closing the door behind him with care that felt intimate. His coat was darkened by rain, his expression drawn by a restraint that mirrored her own. For a moment they stood facing one another, separated by little more than breath and all that could not be said. The silence stretched, not empty, but crowded with every glance they had stolen and every word they had swallowed. "I feared you would not come," he said at last, his voice low, stripped of ceremony. "I feared I would," Eleanor replied. The honesty startled them both. Rain traced restless paths above their heads. Eleanor felt its rhythm inside her chest, steadying and relentless. "You should not be here," she added, though she made no move to leave. "We have already invited enough talk." Julian's mouth curved, not in amusement, but in recognition. "Talk follows us regardless. I wished, at least once, to speak without it listening." He stepped closer, then stopped, as though governed by an invisible line. The restraint cut sharper than boldness. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a composure she did not feel. "Then speak," she said. "But do so plainly. I can endure truth better than uncertainty." He drew a breath that seemed to reach deep into him. "I have been a coward," he began. "Not in action, perhaps, but in feeling. I allowed duty to masquerade as virtue, and in doing so, I wronged you." The words settled heavily between them. Eleanor's first instinct was to deflect, to protect what remained of her dignity. Instead, she held still. "You owe me nothing," she said quietly. "Your life is your own." "That is precisely the lie I told myself," Julian replied. "That my choices harmed no one so long as they were respectable." His gaze flickered, then steadied. "When I agreed to marry your sister, it was to satisfy a promise made years ago, one born of debt and obligation, not affection. I believed affection irrelevant." Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. She turned away, gripping the edge of a marble table to anchor herself. "You should not say this to me." "I must," he insisted. "Because the affection I dismissed did not disappear. It fixed itself where it was never meant to be revealed." She closed her eyes. The scent of blossoms felt suddenly too rich, the air too warm. "If you speak further," she said, "you will ask me to become someone I cannot be." Julian moved then, not toward her, but beside her, his presence a steady heat. "I would never ask you to abandon your honor," he said. "Only to understand mine. I have seen you for years, Eleanor. Your wit, your patience, the way you bear silence as though it were chosen. I loved you long before I knew its name, and feared it long after." The confession rang through her, devastating in its clarity. She turned, searching his face for hesitation, for retreat. She found none. "Love," she said, tasting the word as though it were foreign. "You speak of it as though it absolves consequence." "It condemns me," he answered. "Yet I could no longer bear your suffering in ignorance. Whatever you decide, you deserved the truth." Eleanor felt memory rise like mist, each recollection sharpening rather than softening. She saw herself younger, quieter, always attentive, standing just outside the circle of importance. She saw Julian then too, offering kindness that felt like rescue, unaware of how deeply it would be taken in. The past rearranged itself under his words, moments shifting from coincidence to intention, from accident to choice. It frightened her more than ignorance ever had. If love had been present all along, then her solitude had not been imagined, only postponed. The realization demanded courage she was no longer certain she possessed. Duty pressed upon her from every direction, heavy with expectation, yet something newly awakened pressed back, insistent and alive. To deny it would be safe. To acknowledge it would be honest. Neither path offered peace. Footsteps sounded faintly beyond the glass, distant but approaching. Eleanor felt time contract, every second waited. She thought of Charlotte, of vows forming like chains, of herself standing always at the margin. To love him openly would ruin them all. To deny him now would mark her forever. She reached for the rosemary sprig she had kept pressed in her pocket, the token that had begun this unraveling. Holding it between her fingers, she looked at him with a calm born of resolve. "Then know this," she said softly. "I believe you. And that knowledge will change everything." The footsteps drew nearer. Julian's eyes searched hers, fierce and searching, as though memorizing her. She stepped back, reclaiming distance with visible effort. The moment sealed itself, irrevocable. As the door handle turned, Eleanor felt the truth settle into her bones, heavy and luminous, and understood that secrecy, once confessed, could never again be undone.